Madam President, few issues have bedeviled our country and our political process more than immigration. It's well known by now how difficult it is to get anything done on the topic. Later today, the House will have a vote. I don't know how that will turn out, but we've seen how difficult it is to even get to that point. And the reason why it's a difficult issue is multifaceted. The first is that it involves people. It's easy to throw around numbers, 100,000, 1.1 million a year, 2,000, but these are human beings who, by and large, want to come to America because it's the best country in the world. And so that's one of the things that makes it difficult, is we're talking about human beings. It's not trade, it's not dollars, it's people. The other reason why it's difficult is because we are a nation in which few, if any of us, are but a few generations removed at most from someone who came here from somewhere else. And the closer you are to that reality, the more you identify with those who want to come here. I was blessed to be born in the United States, but I didn't do anything to earn that. I happen to have benefited from the fact that my parents lived 90 miles away from the greatest nation on earth. They could have been born somewhere else. They could have made a different decision in their lives, and I'm not sure what would have happened, quite frankly. Since my parents had me in their 40s, I'm not sure I would have even been born. But I'm a beneficiary of that incredible blessing. The flip side of it is I'm also a lawmaker, and I understand that every nation on this planet has immigration laws. Mexico has immigration laws. Canada has immigration laws. Canada, earlier this week, sent out a statement to TPS recipients in America that if your TPS expires, don't come to Canada because we're not going to let you in. I have personally witnessed the immigration laws in places like Honduras, one of the source countries of some of our migration. I was there 2 years ago, and I visited a migration place where their policy basically is we detain you, we feed you, and we give you 48 hours to get out of the country. So every country in the world has immigration laws, and any time that those laws are challenged by large numbers of people who want to enter outside of those laws, it creates friction and problems. It has throughout the history of this country. It's doing it all over the world right now. The government of Germany the governing coalition could collapse over the issue. Multiple elections in Europe have been decided. In fact, the very future of the EU itself is under duress over the issue of migration and a common border. So this is not just a difficult issue in America, it's a difficult issue around the world. One of the reasons why it's so difficult here is because we have long prided ourselves on being a nation of immigrants, and we remain that. One of the things that isn't repeated enough, and you'll never get this if you listen to some of the way this issue is covered, on either side of this debate, is that every single year over 1 million human beings, over 1 million human beings enter the United States legally, and many of them within 3 to 5 years swear an oath to become American citizens. And I believe with all my heart that strengthens our country. So with all this noise that you're hearing, just remember the baseline. Every single year, over 1 million people come to this country legally. That's happening. It'll happen again this year. And I would tell you, no other nation on earth even comes close to that level of generosity. The problem we have is that in our region, there are countries of incredible instability, and this ebbs and flows. Now, I live in South Florida, a majority-minority community deeply influenced by migration waves of Cubans who came in multiple waves to flee communism, of Haitians who have come through different periods of instability, of people who flee instability, for example, in the 80s in Nicaragua and called us home, of Colombians who fled in the 90s because of violence there, of Venezuelans who seek asylum now because of the situation there. But every time that there is a hemispheric problem, people in the countries seek to go to the greatest nation on earth that's closest to them, by the way, and that's the United States. So this is not new for us. And our challenge is, how can we accommodate that and accommodate the people, accommodate our legacy as a nation of immigrants, but also do it through a system of law? There is nothing wrong with having ordered compassion. We have safety net programs in America that provide people who have come upon tough times with health care and housing and money for food, but there's a process to get it. There's qualifications that you have to meet. There's an application you have to fill out. There's a limit to how long you can use it. That's true of most charities as well. So you can be generous, and yet you can be ordered. But every time that there's a migratory challenge in the region, or any sort of instability in the region, it places migratory pressure on the United States. One of the ones that has arisen lately, over the last few years, is the instability in Honduras, in Guatemala, and in El Salvador. And I can tell you, you can watch the documentaries, you can read the books and the articles, you can interview the people. I know people personally. I don't know them like I met them at an event. I know them, I know their families, I know their stories, because they live in South Florida. I know people who have left because some local gang or thug or organized crime group came to them and said, unless you pay us 10% of what you make this month, we're going to kill your daughter, we're going to kill your wife, and we're going to burn down your store. So when people are told that, they leave. I know people that have left because they can't feed their family. And so they come because they're going to work and send back money so their kids could eat. And I would ask everyone, if you're a parent and your children are hungry and you're fearful that your children or your wife or your family could be killed by a gang, would you not do almost anything to help them? So we understand that part. And that has to be balanced with the reality that America is a country that's proud of its heritage as a nation of immigrants, that continues to be generous in welcoming them, but also has to have a system. It can't be disordered, because otherwise it strains our capacity. And it also overlooks another obligation we have, and that is an obligation to our own people. No nation on earth, not even one as wealthy and as great as America, could welcome every single human being on the planet that wants to come here. That's not harsh, that's true. What other country does? Canada doesn't do that. Mexico doesn't do that. No other nation on earth, including the ones that are criticizing us, have policies like that. Many are much more restrictive than the United States. And most of the nations in Europe, you can go there, but they'll never even let you become a citizen. So every country has its own set of rules, and our rules have fluctuated. There have been times in our history much more restrictive than now in terms of immigration. So we have this situation. We have this incredible instability in places like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. And one of the responses to it, which I strongly support, we'll fund it again this year, is something called the Alliance for Prosperity. It is probably, in the long term, the best thing we can do to deal with the problem we have right now. And what that does is it builds the capacity of the governments in those countries to deal with those gangs that are threatening people, to create economic opportunities so people don't have to leave. By the way, this migration isn't good for those countries. If you're Honduras, and your youngest, hardest working people are leaving, how are you going to build your economy in the future? They don't like it either. We need to help them, and we're trying to, and we're doing that. But that takes time to work. And if you don't think that works, then I ask you, why don't we have a migratory crisis from Peru, or Chile, or Uruguay, or Colombia, or Brazil, or Argentina, or Costa Rica, or Panama? We don't have migratory crises from those countries because while they don't have America's wealth, you can find a job, and you're not being threatened every day by a gang. So the more we could do to help countries reach that point, the less migratory pressure we will have. That is by far the most effective border security measure we could take if it works. We have to make sure that it works. So now we have this situation, and it's a difficult one. And it's, I hear these people on television, and I got to tell you, I don't know where some people get their information or even care about having their information, but they just say things that aren't true. And they make it sound like it's so simple. Here's the bottom line, okay? Imagine for a moment that a family arrives at the U.S. border unlawfully, meaning they don't have a permit to enter, they don't have a visa, they just unlawfully cross the border. You are now apprehended, and you have children with you, and you're an adult. The law says something called the Flores Settlement, which is binding, which the White House is challenging with this executive order. It says you can hold the children for 20 days. You can detain the adults. They violated a law, whether you want it to be a misdemeanor, if it's a repeated offense, it's a felony. It could even be a civil offense, potentially. But you can detain them if you need to, but you can't detain the children. So this is a dilemma, because if you don't detain people, we know that a substantial percentage and I mean a very high percentage of people, once apprehended and released, they never show up for the hearing. They're scheduled for a hearing before an immigration judge. It could take a couple years. And when the hearing comes, we don't even know where they are to even notify them of it. They just don't show up. They don't show up at all. So you know that if you let them go, you'll never see them again. You are basically passing them in. But you can't detain the kids they came with. And so you're left with this choice. I can't detain the kids, therefore I can't detain the family together. So I either let them all go and never hear from them again, or I detain the adults and separate them from their children. And that's a decision the administration made, along with saying we're going to enforce every single one of these cases. But I already told you, if you let them go, your chances of ever having them show up again are virtually nil in many cases. Well, that led to the problem. Because even though we're a nation of law, we're also a nation with a deep Judeo-Christian principle. And you're watching on television, you're seeing kids crying, and as a parent, forget about the senator now, you're a parent and you're thinking to yourself, this is horrifying. This is happening in America. That has to end. And so the administration says we're going to end it, and we're going to detain them together, and someone's going to sue us under the Flores settlement, which is why the government must act, the Congress must act. So I watched some of the speeches on the floor last night from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and the best way I could describe the argument as I understood it, and if I'm wrong, then somebody should come tell me, but I heard the arguments carefully because I was trying to figure out, well, there's got to be a way to deal with this. It's a tough issue. Their argument was, number one, do not detain the children at all. Keep the Flores settlement in place. Don't detain the children. Number two, don't separate the families. So that means not only can you not detain the children, but don't detain the parents. So let them go. And number three, if they don't show up for their hearing and you eventually run into them, don't deport them either. So if we're not going to detain children, we're not going to detain parents, and if they don't show up for the hearing, we're not going to deport them unless they're violent criminals, then the de facto policy is if you come to the United States alone, you will be detained and returned, but if you come to the United States with children, you will be released and never deported, potentially. Now, I want to tell you, and this is not conjecture, okay? I already told you, I know people. I want to tell you the perception that creates. It creates the perception, it creates the incentive. People can argue about whether dividing families is a deterrent or not. I don't even want to make that argument because I don't think that's a deterrent we should use as this nation. It's not who we are, it's not who should we. We should never say we're going to punish your kids in order to keep you from doing something. But I can tell you that whether or not it's a deterrent, it is most definitely an incentive to have a policy that says if you come alone, you'll be apprehended, detained, and returned. But if you come with kids, we're going to let you in. Because it is true. I find it to be cruel to separate these kids from their parents. I want to tell you what else is cruel. And that is the journey that people have to undertake in the hands of some of the most horrible human beings on this planet who traffic human beings through Mexico and across our border. And let me tell you how horrible it is. It's so horrible that many of the young women who make that journey actually, before they go on the journey, ensure that they get on birth control because they expect to be sexually assaulted. That's how cruel it is. Cruel because children disappear on that journey, and we don't know what happens, but they vanish. It's cruel because families are often robbed and beaten on that journey. It is one of the nastiest, most cruel journeys anyone could imagine. I'll never forget being in Honduras a couple years ago. We were at a migrant center, and our U.S. Customs Border Protection people that are embedded there alongside our Honduran partners were talking to this young man who happened to be from Cuba, who was on his way to the United States, and he warned him, he showed him, he talked him through, he said, you are about, once you cross this border, you are about to be in the hands of some of the worst human beings on the planet who make a habit of killing people, assaulting people, trafficking people. This young man was determined. I don't know what happened to him, to be honest with you. I gave him my number. I told him, if you make it to the States and we could be helpful, whatever it might be. We never heard from him again. I imagine he made it or something else happened. I personally tried to discourage him from making the journey. So yes, it is cruel to divide families. It is also cruel to have an incentive for people to bring children on this journey. And that's what this is. And to go back to the point, unless I'm wrong, as I understand it, the policy that we're being asked to support by some is don't detain the kids, don't detain the parents in order to not separate the families, and when they don't show up for the hearing, don't deport them. Well, then your de facto law basically is if you come to the United States alone, you'll be detained and returned, but if you come with kids, you will get to stay. That's irresponsible. And if that is, in fact, the policy, then you should admit it. This is our policy. This is what we think the law should be. And you can't go around saying, I'm for border security, but they'll never tell you what they're for. And you can't go around saying we should only enforce our immigration laws on dangerous criminals. Everyone agrees with that one. The bottom line is, if we want to continue to be a nation of immigrants and of immigration, then we have to have an ordered system of immigration. Otherwise, you have what we have now. You have what we have now in America, and you have what we have now all over the world. And that is people, a nation of immigrants, many turning on immigration. Not because they don't believe in it, but because they think what we have now is unsustainable and wrong. And you'll never hear me say that these people are animals or terrible people. They're not. Look, anytime you take thousands of people and put them together, of course there's going to be bad people among them. But it is my experience and my deep belief that the overwhelming majority of people are just looking for a better life, to send money back to their family, to live in a safer place, to reunite with loved ones that are already here. Their motives are not wrong, but there has to be a process by which you do it. And our laws put us in this position every single day. I'll never forget, a handful of years ago, a home across the street from ours was occupied by a family. And I don't know what happened, but well, I know what happened, obviously. At some point, they didn't pay the rent long enough, and the landlord evicted them, which requires you to go to the courthouse. You got to get a court ruling. The sheriff's office comes, opens the door, and takes out all of your furniture and puts it on the curb. And we drove by, and we saw this family sitting there on their couch, 3 kids, the mom on the cell phone calling somebody, all their possessions sitting in plastic bags on the curb because they didn't pay their rent. They were evicted, and it was painful to watch. And we did what we could. We tried to talk and see if there was anything we could do to provide them, made sure they had a place to stay that evening. But no one suggested that what we should do is just not allow landlords to no longer evict people for not paying rent. No one suggested that because we realized if we ever have a law like that, no one will ever rent people property again. If we stop enforcing the right of a landlord to evict people from their homes, if we stop enforcing that, then there'll be no more landlords. No one will ever put anything up for rent. We'll have a housing crisis. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't break our heart to see the images of what that means when it's applied. I know people that have lost their homes in foreclosure, their homes of their dream. They came across some difficult times, they couldn't pay the mortgage, and they were out of their home. And it breaks your heart. But I haven't heard anyone suggest that we should make mortgages unenforceable. Now, it's not the same thing. But my point to you is that our laws always put us in this situation. But the answer can't be don't enforce the law. Every single day, even as I speak to you now, somewhere in this country, some adult is going to be arrested, and this adult is going to go to jail, perhaps for many years, and their children are not going to be able to see them. Now, I'm not claiming that someone who commits a horrible crime in America is the same as someone who crosses our border. My point to you is that happens every day, and it doesn't to diminish it. But no one has suggested that we should no longer arrest anyone or apply the law to people if it would divide them from their families, because jails are full of people that have been divided from their families. I make these points not as comparison. I'm not saying evicted from your home and crossing the border is the same thing. I'm not saying committing a serious crime that condemns you to years in jail and crossing the border is the same thing. I'm here to tell, what I am saying is that oftentimes the application of our law leads to results that trouble our heart. But we recognize if we don't apply the law, the alternative is as bad, if not worse. And that's where we are. The reason why a nation of immigrants has a significant percentage of Americans that frankly want to see immigration significantly slashed is not because they've forgotten where they came from, but because they think this thing's out of control. Because they're okay with 1 million people or 800,000 people a year coming legally. What they're not okay with is anyone who wants to come coming anytime they want, anywhere they want. And they react against it. And it's easy to hear these people on television say, well, that's something horrible that's going on in America, it's the president's fault, it's this or that's fault. It's happening all over the world. It's happening in every country in Europe. It's increasingly now putting pressure on Canada. It's happening in Mexico, which a few years ago began to crack down on their southern border. And so the best way forward is a bill that Senator Tillis and others filed yesterday, and that is one that will allow us to house families together while pending their hearing. Some will qualify for asylum and get to stay. Others will have to return together. Is it perfect? No. The United States government is not in the business of housing families. We do have an obligation to ensure that we can expedite their hearings, so they're not there for a long time. We do have an obligation to say, if you legitimately qualify for asylum, you should be given the opportunity to apply for it. We do have an obligation to say that while we detain families, we are going to provide them safe, sanitary conditions, because that's who we are as a people, and that's who we should be. We do have an obligation to do all of that. And that's why this bill adds 200 new judges to help expedite, and why it helps call for expediting cases that involve families with children. I know this is a tough issue, but our law cannot be that if you come here unlawfully with children, you get to stay. We're not going to enforce it, because you are creating a cruel incentive for more people to do that. And you're basically saying, we have laws, but we'll refuse to enforce them. And then you don't have an immigration system. And then people turn on immigration. And then we can't get solved the problems we have today. And I say this to you in closing as someone who is by no means an immigration restrictionist. By no means. In fact, I support doing something reasonable with the people that have been here for a long time and are not dangerous criminals. They're now part of our country. I support extending TPS for the Haitian community, many of whom are now business owners in Miami-Dade County, where I live. I support extending TPS for the Honduran community, who are here legally, by the way, in both cases. TPS makes you legal. Some of them own businesses. Some of them have graduated and are going to medical school. I support all of that. I support doing something responsible with people that were brought here as children, through no fault of their own, have grown up here their entire lives. Some of them don't even speak any language but English. And finding some permanency to their status in this country and a path to citizenship. I support all of that stuff. I also support enforcing our immigration laws so we can welcome more people in the future. But there has to be a process. Every sovereign country in the world has laws and a process, and most of them enforce their laws in ways that are much more stringent, in many cases, much more barbaric than anything that you'll ever be accused of having done in the United States. And that's not what I'm advocating. I don't know anyone who is. So it's been a tough week on a tough issue. I hope that we will act. I know how appealing this is as a political issue. I know how much cable news time people get on both sides talking about it. But I hope we can make progress at least on this one little piece and then move forward and do the rest. But this one little piece, I hope we'll just deal with it. And I think we've got a proposal before the Senate that doesn't make the situation perfect. But it sure makes it a lot better than what it is right now. And it's sure preferable to dividing families. And it sure is preferable to a law that tells people, bring your children on this very dangerous journey, because if you do, you'll get to stay. And it's my hope we'll act and get something done. Madam President, I yield the floor.